So we finished glazing the all the metal in Gulliman blue, and as you might be able to pick out, there is a slight bluish tinge now to all the metal. Another thing you can use, I forgot to mention that you can use glazes for, is if, for example, you perhaps over-highlight something and the colours are a bit too stark. For example, if you are painting a blue model and you over-highlight it a bit, and it's a bit of a stark contrast between the colours, you can use some glaze to sort of bring those highlights down and tie the model together. I don't usually use that for that purpose, but it's definitely something you can consider. So now, before we start upon the meat of this project, which is to say the plate armor, there is a final touch we need to do, and that is to paint the cloth parts of the rider. And there's not a lot of cloth on this fellow, because unlike a lot of other Warriors of the Dark Gods models, he doesn't have a cape. But there's a little cloth in between the armoured joints and along the back and lower arm, or upper arm actually. So we're going to paint that in before we move on to the plate armour. Now, initially, can't even speak the language anymore. Initially, I thought I was going to use purple for this, but because purple usually is quite a dark colour, it darkens the model down. Instead, I've decided to use red. The red combination will be quite similar to the part I used in the mount's mouth. It will be slightly different, and of course it won't be covered in glaze. So I'll be doing this off screen, because I doubt any one of you want to watch me painting red all over again. So it'll be on pieces of cloth on the rider, and also upon these things. There's strips of cloth that have skulls hanging from them on the mount. And also, quite a nice piece of detail I noticed is that there's actually cloth on the inside here of the mount's barding. I find that funny because, I mean, whoever sculpted this model must think, yeah, I mean, yeah, they are sort of civilization-destroying crusaders from the depths of hell, but even I won't make my mount suffer, sort of be a bit uncomfortable from the chafing of chainmail. I mean, we're monsters, but we're not that bad. So I'll just go ahead and paint that off screen, and then we'll start in on the plate armor. Okay, so after having finished the red cloth off screen, we are almost ready to get started on the meat of the Warriors of the Dark Gods, and that is the plate armor. Now, as you can see, there's quite a bit of cloth on the rider, although a lot of the areas around the sort of the shoulders and will get covered up once we glue his shoulder plates on. So yeah, that is where we stand at the moment. And next step is to get started on the plate armor. So then, it's time for the most important part of any Warriors of the Dark Gods army, and that is the plate armor. Now, we are going to paint the plate armor of this model a bit of an unorthodox colour for Warriors of the Dark Gods, and we're going to paint it stark white to really sort of pick up that winter scheme. Now, white is a bit of a tricky colour to layer with, since you can't just paint it stark white from the beginning, because that gives it a very flat and boring appearance. So you have to start off with something that is white approximate and then build our way up. And what we're going to do for that, for the base coat, is to use a colour called Celestra Grey. This is quite a light grey, and we're just going to apply that to all the plated areas, and that is quite a lot. So once we've finished with the plate armour, this model will really be a nice big step towards completion. And we're just going to pick a medium brush. Like so. And we're going to start applying, that's quite goopy. And we're just going to start applying the Celestra Grey all over the armour. Covers quite well for being such a bright colour on black, but I think we'll be doing 2 layers anyway. Phew! Okay, now that took a bit longer than expected. But as you now can see, the entire model and all the armour plating has been covered with a base coat of Celestra Grey. And, well, as you can maybe also see, I have finished painting, you know, getting old and slightly senile. I forgot to paint the ribbons hanging down supporting skulls, so I've painted those red as well, together with all the rest of the cloth details. Now, the next thing to do is to wash the armour, and for that we're just going to bring out our old friend Nuln Oil, and we're just going to make a good old repetition of the thing we've done a couple of times already. Just bring out the good old wash brush and get to work. I'm a Varanguard and I'm okay. I butcher all night and I slaughter all day. I cut down men with the meaty crunch. I massacre families. On Wednesdays I go shopping, then go on a killing spree. Alright, so now we've finished shading the plate armour in Nuln Oil, and as you can see, I've left the areas around the runes free of shade, and this is for 2 reasons. Firstly, that area, the cracks and dents in the armour that we would otherwise want to pick out with a shade, they're already shaded by the blue that we put in earlier. And secondly, we don't really need those parts shaded, and secondly, they're quite difficult to shade, and you don't want any of that Nuln Oil to seep into the cracks of the blue and diminish the blue. So now we're going to move on to layering this, and if experience tells me anything, this will be the longest single stretch of painting this model, because there's a lot of white to work with, or a lot of plate armour we get to white. Now, the paint we'll be using for this is called Ulthuan Grey. It's a very, very, very light grey. So on its own, it looks white. You can only see the difference between this and white when you actually put it next to something that is well and truly white, which will show up when we highlight this armour. Now, since most of these plates, they don't really have any they don't really have any edges. Most of them are encircled by this sort of these edges, which will later paint gold. What you want to do with the layering is to just fill in these areas But what you want to do is you want to leave a thin edge just around the upmost parts of the plate, so you get a nice piece of shadowing. I want it a bit thinner than that even. So just to leave a thin line of the shading intact along the edges of the plate. Bloody hell, that ate a lot of time. Oh well, here we go. I have now layered the entire, all the sort of plate armour in Ulthuan Grey. So, and as you can see, it looks almost white, or it looks pretty much white. But what we're going to do now is just finish a final highlight. Now, this will be a bit different, or slightly different from normal edge highlighting, at least for most of the model, because as you can see, most of the plates are completely ensconced in sort of metal trim, which we're going to fix later in gold. So we can't really edge highlight this in the way we'd edge highlight, in the way we edge highlighted, for example, the red along here, because there are no raised parts. But we want a bit of a highlight on this anyway, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the good old colour Skull White, which is now called, I think it's like Ceramite White or whatever. And we're going to do a bit of edge highlighting as well on the pieces of armour that allow it, but on these parts that are completely surrounded by metal trimming, we're just going to do a bit like this. Just move the horsey out of the way. We'll just take the rider. Right, here we go. So we're just going to take a tiny bit of white. Don't want much. And then what we're going to do is just provide a thin white bar along the edge of the armour within the boundary, so we don't mess up any of that nice shading we've done before, but just to give you the illusion that light is hitting this armour from a certain angle. You don't want to encompass all of the armour in sort of a circle around within the ribbing. You just want to cover certain parts, so you get the illusion that light is hitting this armour from certain angles and providing slightly lighter points to the armour. So, like so. And for the parts that actually have edges, where the white goes all the way up to the edge, we'll just be doing some nice common edge highlighting, so just providing a thin line of paint along the edges. Oops, that wasn't good. I have to reshade that a bit. And then crosswise all the way along here. Yep. Wow, okay, holy bloody hell, that took a while. But our white plate armour is now complete, with all the highlighting done. And what we're going to do now is, before we get to the nice golden parts, we need to finish up a few minor details. And among these is both a few leather pieces, and also the scant amount of skin that is shown by the rider, most notably around the neck. So we'll try to get these details tidied up as quick as possible so we can move on to the more interesting parts. Now for the skin, I'm going to do this a bit quickly, and we're going to start with a base coat of Bugman's Glow. Just nice, simple base coat, as we've already done a couple of times. And we'll follow with a quick wash with Rakeland Flesh Shade. Now I'll be doing both of these off screen because quite frankly watching me base coat and shade for the 15th time this episode is probably going to bore everyone to death. So I'll just finish it and then we'll toddle on to the layering. Okay, so now for the quick layer of the skin, and what we're going to use here is a colour called Cadian Flesh Tone, and this will make the skin, it'll lighten it up a bit, but it will still provide a fair bit of sort of reddish colour to the skin, and then we'll be using a highlight to bring that down a bit. And technique we'll be using is nothing different from anything we've done before. It's just normal layering, painting all along the raised, well, pretty much any, not so much the raised areas as every part that is hasn't been sort of outside the recesses. There we go, all along the sort of raised areas of the muscle. So, now that we've finished adding the layering to the muscle, you can see I've added Cadian Flesh Tone all over the raised parts of the muscle with some shadow in between. And to finish this off, we are going to add a highlight of Kislev flesh, and this is to lighten the skin a little bit, because the skin tone we're looking for is a little bit lighter than what we currently have, and that is because people who live in the north under wintry conditions, as we're going for here, usually have slightly lighter skin tones. So we just want to add a little bit of a highlight to this skin, and we'll just be applying that in the exact same method as we used to layer the muscle of the demonic horse thing. So we'll just be taking a really fine brush and just add some Kislev flesh to all the central areas of the muscle, the utmost raised points and central areas. There you go. And there we go. The skin has been finished. So with that, we only have one thing left to do before we move on to one of the most important parts of this model, which is to say the golden decoration around the armour. And what we need to do now is to finish off the leather sort of straps and parts of the saddle we haven't done yet, a few straps around the throat, and some leather padding different areas of the model, and also the wrappings of the spear or halberd or whatever this is. And when it comes to leather, you usually with models you have two kinds of leather on a model. You have functional leather, which is straps and the like, really, belts as well. And then you have sort of what I like to call comfortable leather, which is boots, or in this case the saddle, and also some leather padding around the neck of the model here, of the mount. And usually I try to paint these in quite distinctly different colours. Comfortable leather I try to make quite warm and a little bit more colourful, while functional leather I try to make actually quite dull, as it has only been created to serve a function rather than to provide some sort of comfort or or aesthetic. So what we're going to do is we're going to base coat these leathers in 2 different colours. The functional leather, we will just provide a quick base coat of dried bark, and with the more comfortable parts we will we will base coat in Rhinox hide. Now these 2 colours are both dark brown, and they're, well, reasonably close to each other. However, as you can probably see, the Rhinox hide is darker, but it's also richer, and this will provide a much more in-depth and warm feeling to the end than using dried bark. And this is exactly what we want for comfortable versus functional leather. So what I'll be doing here is I will add what I deem to be this more warm leather. We'll be using the wrappings all over the spear, and also we will paint the saddle part here under the saddle, and also some leather wrapping here. There's some leather leather straps here further down the neck, and we'll be using the other brown for that. But then there's some leather padding sticking up here around the throat, which we'll be using Rhinox hide for. So let's get down to basing in these 2 colours then. Okay, so we have finished with base coating the layer in the leather in Rhinox hide and dried bark. Now it might be a bit tricky for you to see the difference between the 2 at this level, but we'll be lighting it up as we go along. So the Rhinox hide have gone on the saddle and a few lower parts of the saddle, and then on the leather sort of padding here, and the dried bark has gone on all the different sort of straps, like the one securing the saddle, and here around the throat, and also the strap securing the sort of clothing and armour for the rider. Now we're just going to give both of these leather colours a quick wash using good old Agrax Earthshade. So we're just going to bring those, give those a quick wash, and then we'll start working with them properly. So the leather is washed and ready to go, and hasn't completely dried yet. Buggeroo. Anyway, now we're going to start to handle these 2 types of leather a little bit differently. And to start off, we're going to focus on the leather straps, the functional leather. And for that, I'm not going to layer it. I am instead only going to apply 2 edge highlights to all leather straps and such on the model. And the reason for this is because I don't want to give it any depth. I don't want to give it any character. This kind of leather is only used for function and not decoration. So we only really want to frame it a bit and give it a bit of an edge effect. For that, I'm going to start by highlighting all the edges of all the straps and such with a brown called Gawthor Brown. And this is just your simple average edge highlight, so it's not really that difficult. So we're just going to use a really fine brush for this, as with all other edge highlights we've done. Just take a little bit of colour. And then run it just along the utmost edges of the straps. So the highlighting with the Gawthor brown has been done, and you can see a bit of a sort of crisp edges along the lines of the leather straps. We're going to finish with a final edge highlight of these straps, or at least part of them, using a colour called Baneblade Brown. Unfortunately, I bought this during a time when the Games Workshop seemed to have a spree of mislabelling their paints, so for some reason it's called Varanguard Blue, which is a bit silly. But anyway, we are going to... Ooh, a bit of a plastic. Okay. So, just going to provide a nice and easy edge highlight to lighten up these edges a bit. So here we go. Now, another reason I'm choosing to not to layer these leather straps is, if you have ever seen sort of leather straps created, at least in a medieval sort of clothing kind of sense, they are usually cut from reasonably stiff leather that doesn't flex or leave valleys, or it doesn't really have much depth in it. It's usually quite stiff, which means that it doesn't really have much of a three-dimensional texture to it. It only has lighter edges, seeing as the cuts in the leather make the edges lighter than the rest of the straps. So yeah, just was a bit heavy-handed, need to correct that. So yeah, just lighten up the edges a little bit. And with a highlight of Baneblade Brown, the leather straps are now finished. And that makes us want to move on to the other type of leather, sort of the comfortable leather. And we're going to be doing this as we've done everything else on this model. We're going to layer it, and we'll be using a layer called Doomball Brown for this. Now, Doomball Brown is a reasonably it's a lighter brown with quite a bit of red in it, so it's sort of a bit rust coloured. And we want this bit of red or a bit of, well, darkish colour, because even though we want to lighten this brown up a bit and make it a bit warmer, we still want to make sure that it doesn't sort of become a happy colour. We still want to keep the sort of the dark and evil theme of the army, so we don't want to lighten it up too much. Just layer it up. So, with the last layer of leather firmly in place, it's time to just finish off the leather section with a final highlight. And for this we'll be using Scrag Brown, which is quite a light colour, so we'll just be using it for some careful edge highlighting of the sort of comfortable leather areas. And after that is done, then it's time to move on to the final flourish with this model, which is to say the gold, which is when things really start to get interesting. So we'll just apply a neat edge highlight of Scrag Brown to the leather.